This is our chapter on public opinion. And so, when we're talking about public opinion, we're talking about how we, the citizens, feel about politics, about government, about events that are happening in our country. And so, being in touch with public opinion is beneficial for our elected officials and those working in government because if they're truly doing their jobs correctly, they want to create policy and laws based on what the people want to see. So, public opinion, like we said, citizen attitudes about political issues, leaders, institutions, events. We're seeing, public opinion play out in our system right now. COVID 19, the pandemic, and people have very differing opinions about wearing masks and about social distancing and whether our kids should go back to school and all that kind of stuff. So, there's a lot of things that inform, public opinion. One are values and beliefs. This would be, principles that shape a person's point of view about politics. And values are very heavily tied to morals, and then morals are very heavily tied to religion. So, a lot of times, people may have opinions based on, their own personal idea of morality. Like if we're talking about an issue like abortion. Abortion, people's stance on that is heavily influenced by whether they are religious, what religion they practice, their understanding of that morality. So that can heavily influence how what someone's opinion is about what's going on in our country. Also, political ideology. So, political ideology, cohesive set of beliefs that form a general philosophy about the role of government. Um, in our country, because we have a two-party system, we tend to look at ideology through two lenses, being liberal and being conservative. And, those are generally, they're pretty descriptive of most ideology in our country. There's variations on both, with people being extremely liberal, moderately liberal, moderate, where they're right in the middle of the political spectrum, conservative, far right conservative, all that kind of stuff. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Um, but yeah, conservatives and liberals have different ideas on the role of government, which we'll talk about in a minute. So that's going to influence how a person feels about what's going on in the country. And then attitudes. Attitudes or opinions on a specific preference, on a particular issue. Um, we can see this right now with the pandemic and COVID 19 and everything. We would hope that people are basing their attitudes and opinions on science, on facts, things like that. But, in our country, that's not always the case. Some people just base this on how they feel. Oh, I don't want to wear a mask because it's uncomfortable. Masks don't work, even though science tells us otherwise, So, because of the First Amendment and because of the right to free speech, people are free to express those ideas. The problem is when, some of that misinformation gets disseminated widely, it influences people's behaviors. And so we would hope that people are taking in information based on, reliable sources, facts, science, that kind of stuff. But we know that that's not always the case. And then, of course, there are some big things that influence public opinion. Things that tend to be associated with personal identity. Things like race, gender, income, age, religion, what part of the country someone is from, and we'll get into those in just a minute. Now, when people talk about their opinions and whether they want to do something or not do something, like we said, a lot of people will invoke the idea of liberty, that they are free to do whatever they want to do because of the Bill of Rights. And we've talked about liberty, so I won't kind of go back into that conversation because that was our first chapter or second chapter where we talked about that. But, a lot of people will invoke that as a means to not do something. Like, again, what we are facing, the pandemic has kind of consumed all of us. It's consumed the news media, it's consumed politics. And so, people say, oh, it's my liberty, my freedom not to have to comply with this, that, and the other, but and that goes back to that idea of individualism, that sometimes we don't think about ourselves as a member of a community, but rather we think of ourselves as an individual first. And if I don't like something, then I shouldn't have to do it, regardless of how that affects other people. And so the understanding of liberty, you know, the way the founders defined it was the whole, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. But, sometimes people put personal happiness above, what's good for the country as a whole or what's good for the community. We talked about these other concepts, equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome and stuff. We talked about those, so I won't go back into those. All right, ideology. So, like I said, our two main ideologies that we tend to express our system through here are liberalism and conservatism. And so, depending on where you're from and what part of the political spectrum you're on, these words can be used as insults. If you've lived in Texas, I'm born and raised here, people like to throw around the word liberal as though it's an insult, when it's really just a different way of thinking about government. So, talking about liberalism, at its core, liberals tend to be okay with federal government being in charge, with a bigger government using the power of government to create reform in our social systems, to intervene in the economy, to create equality, provide social services like welfare, and to protect consumers, protect the environment. So liberals tend to be okay with big government, with regulations from government. The idea being that if we're going to try and create equality in our country, if we're going to try and promote justice and things like that, and provide for the basic needs of citizens, that really only government has the power to do that. And so liberals are more in favor of spending money, spending government money towards creating equality and things like that. The flip side, conservatism, which is the most prevalent ideology, though that could be changing in Texas. Conservatives favor small government, and so if you remember when we were talking about the Constitution, the first split between the founding fathers was over how much power federal government should have. Conservatives tend to believe that if federal government gets too big, then it starts to get too involved in people's personal lives, can limit individual freedom, that the government should stay out of the marketplace and the economy and let the market sort itself out. Conservatives don't like drastic reform all at one time. Instead, they favor maintaining the status quo and doing incremental change very slowly. So, conservatism, that's what it is, doing things in a conservative fashion. Now, that is the core of conservative ideology. Where things have changed in our country is that conservatism has become intertwined with religion. This idea that conservatives also tend to gravitate towards traditional family values. And when we say traditional family values in this country, we mean Christianity, because it is the founders, a large portion of the founders were practicing Christians. Christianity is still the most practiced religion in the United States. And so one of the kind of paradoxes here is that conservatives don't want government to limit personal freedom, but yet they're okay with government promoting religious ideas like restricting abortion or preventing gay marriage, which essentially limits personal freedom. So there's a bit of a paradox there now that conservatism has become intertwined with Christian religion. A couple of other ideologies that are becoming a little more recognized in our country. The first is libertarianism, and there's different ways that people interpret libertarianism, but libertarians tend to agree with conservatives in They want very small government. Really, the only government program libertarians tend to be in favor of is public education. Everything else, they believe the government should stay out of it. The services should be privatized. The free market should sort things out. But when it comes to social issues like how people live their lives, uh, legalization of marijuana, all that kind of stuff, they tend to be a little more liberal. They believe that government shouldn't be telling people what they can and can't do based on any kind of morality. So libertarians kind of embody a bit of both sides, true libertarianism. Now, in the South, you get a little more conservative type of libertarianism where it tends to be more about, I should be able to own as many guns as I want to, and I shouldn't have to pay my taxes. Taxation is theft and that kind of stuff. So, just like the other two ideologies, it can be extreme. There's extreme sides of it as well. And then socialism. Socialism is the big boogeyman in the United States. You'll hear, conservative politicians invoke socialism to scare the public, and you'll hear kind of moderate liberals not, kind of distance themselves from the idea of socialism. Uh, the funny thing is that we already have socialism in the United States. We just don't call it as such. Socialism is social ownership that is backed up by the authority of government. So, if you look at our public education system, we all pay taxes into the federal government. The federal government then takes those taxes and reallocates it around the country to pay for an education system that we in turn don't have to pay tuition to and things like that. That is a socialist system. The idea is that, for the country to do well, people need to have an education, so we invest in that system, and it's kind of owned by all of us. That's what socialism is at its core. It's not communism. Communism is something very different. And in our country, you hear like Bernie Sanders. He talks about the idea of democratic socialism, which is, the same type of system like you see in European countries, where they still have free markets, they have private ownership, but the government runs programs that have to do with the personal welfare of people, like education, health care, and things like that. So the difference between us and them, we're paying almost as much to our government as they do in taxes. If you look at countries like the Nordic countries, like Sweden and Denmark and Norway, people there pay about 50% tax rate of their earnings. The difference between them and us is that they get free college and university. They get health care that is taken care of. They get paid maternity leave for up to 12 to 18 months. So the difference is that they're getting more back for their tax money than we tend to. The difference between them and us, though, is those are very small countries. We are definitely, population wise, much larger than almost every European country there is. And so there's always this question as to whether those systems could work here because they work there. Um, you know, if we ever make that jump to say having a socialized healthcare system, it's going to be an interesting thing to figure out because the United States just is different in its attitude and its mentality, and we are a large country both in population and landmass, so it's harder to manage than some of those smaller countries. And then there's moderates. Moderates are those people in the middle. They tend to like ideas from all sides of the political spectrum. These are the undecided voters that candidates are going after in every election. And the majority of people say that they are moderate, that they just want to hear good ideas and candidates that they can believe in. If you look here at this chart, and it only goes to 2014, I need to see if I can find a newer one. But you can see this is kind of the change in political ideology in our country. The orange line is conservatism, and you can see, it's starting to decline around 2014. Now, I'd be curious to see if it went up again with Trump's election or not. But as of this chart, it is in a little bit of a decline. And it could be a generational thing that accounts for that. Most of our baby boomers tend to identify as conservative, and many of them are, passing on. And now we see a lot of people identifying as moderates, and moderates are kind of on the upswing, on this chart. A lot of millennials and Gen Zers identify as moderates, maybe with a lean to one side, but just want good ideas that are going to enable them to have a good future. And then if you look at liberalism, it's lower percentage wise, but it is on an increase, whereas conservatism is on a decrease. And I'll be curious to see if those points ever start to meet and intersect, or how that's going to change. Now, other than our political, or our political ideologies are how we feel about government. They tend to inform how we vote and things like that. But what pushes us towards these ideologies? Well, that's a concept that we call political socialization. The things in our life that influence our idea of politics, our beliefs, our values, things like that. And we call those things agents of socialization. And so, these are all the things in our life that help us form our opinions. And probably the first thing that will influence a person's political beliefs is their family. Many people, many of you may still share the same political beliefs as your parents. And a lot of people, for the early part of their life, that is the case, because that is our first exposure to political thought. Is, how do our parents feel? What candidates are our parents supporting? All that kind of stuff. And so a lot of us will, for some time, maybe, hold those same political beliefs. And then as we get older and we get exposed to more information and things like that, maybe they shift to something else, or maybe they stay the same, but now we understand better why our beliefs are what they are. Um, and as we get older and our networks expand, friends, coworkers, colleagues in college, they will play a part in helping us form our political beliefs as well. Education. Now, all of you are here at the university getting an education. Many of you are doing it because you want a great job. That's a big motivation for most people when they come to college. But even though politics and government may not be your thing, or, I know the majority of you are probably not majoring in political science. But the thing is, because you are now a highly educated individual, and of course, every single one of you is going to graduate with your bachelor's, I have no doubt. Um, you have an understanding, even if you just take this class, and I'm your only exposure to political thought. Um, you're going to understand these things better and understand how they affect you. And so, as you are graduating, getting your first job, getting married, having kids, all that kind of stuff, you're going to understand how what is happening in government is going to affect your life on a personal level, and that is entirely attributable to your level of education. And so people with a higher level of education tend to be more engaged with the political system, are more likely to vote in elections, and tend to hold stronger opinions, because now, you understand why you're paying taxes. You understand how these things are going to affect your children, all that kind of stuff. So, the higher the level of your education, the more likely you are to engage. Now, the next one is the one that makes people uncomfortable to talk about. Race. And we are having lots of conversations in our country today about race and systemic racism and police brutality and mistakes that our country has made in the past. And the fact of the matter is, we don't like to talk about race because it makes us uncomfortable, but people of different races experience this country in different ways. And that's something that we have to acknowledge, even if it makes us uncomfortable to do that and to talk about it. Um, you know, Growing up Latino in this country, I have a different perspective than someone who grew up African American versus someone who grew up white or Asian or whatever. And so the thing is that we tend to not want to listen to what people have to say about their own experience because it doesn't match our own. And I think if we stop and have those conversations and truly try and understand each other, we could get to a place where we are handling race better, handling social issues better. This is just my opinion, and you can agree or not agree. It doesn't matter. But just look at this chart here on the right. This is a survey that was done. I believe it was done by the Pew Research group, and the survey asked white respondents and black respondents if they felt they were treated less fairly in certain situations in our country. So look at that first question. Do you think you were treated less fairly? Do you think blacks are treated less fairly than whites in dealing with the police? 54% of white people said yes, compared to 90% of black people. That is a 36-point difference. And that is a difference that is, if you are a researcher doing surveys, that is a difference that is impossible to ignore. That is just, it's glaringly obvious that there is a difference in the way these two groups of people are experiencing our country. And acknowledging it doesn't make you complicit or, for doing this to people, but it does open up the opportunities to have conversations about it. The next question: do you feel black people are treated less fairly than whites at work, in public school, in voting? All of these have significant discrepancies. It's telling us that there is a difference in the way that people experience this country. And so what do we do with that information? That's where we're at right now, is how do we move forward? We have to listen to each other. We have to make some compromises and agreements. That's the tough part. And that's what we're going through right now. Ethnicity is different than race. And when we're talking about ethnicity in this country, we tend to be talking about Latinos. If you've ever looked at a government form like the census or passport application or your taxes or whatever, Latinos are the only group of people who have to check a second box in regards to their identity. The racial categories in this country the idea of race does not include Latino, Hispanic as a race. It is included as an ethnicity. So Latinos have to decide what race we're going to select and then indicate that we are Latino or Hispanic. And this question, I'm actually doing some research on the census. This question confuses people because they don't understand it if they've come here from another country. But when the way this plays out in our politics, people, depending on what country they're from, country of origin, especially in the Latino world, have different concerns. If you are looking at people from Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States, therefore they are citizens of the United States. People from Cuba, because of our historic conflict with the Castro regimes, people from Cuba, if they come to the United States, declaring that they are a refugee from Cuba, they will be given citizenship. That's just our policy. Every other Latin country in the world has to worry about immigration and citizenship issues. So it sets those two countries apart in that they have the issue of immigration is not something they have to be concerned with. So they tend to be a little more conservative than people from any other Latin country in Central and South America. So ethnicity, and this can apply to a lot of different groups today that we don't tend to think of, like Asians. Asian people, depending on your country of origin, will have very different concerns and culture and things like that. So ethnicity is different than race, and it's one that kind of confuses people. Gender and sex, we have in our country what is called the gender gap, and this refers to the gap between the way men and women tend to vote. Now, this is a broad generalization based on statistical evidence. If we looked at this on a more individual level or state by state level, it would be different. But nationwide, we see that women tend to show a slight lean towards the Democratic Party. Men tend to lean towards the Republican Party. Women tend to advocate for more liberal type issues. Women still have concerns that they want addressed of equality in the decisions they make about their body, the workplace, all that kind of stuff, and that those issues tend to kind of fall more on the liberal side of the spectrum. So there is a significant gap between the way that people vote based on their sex and gender identity. Religion, we talked about. The group that nobody talks about, though, the fastest growing group of people in our country, are people who don't identify with a religion. We know that Christianity is still the most practiced religion in our country, but we're closely approaching, or we are rapidly approaching about 30% of the country. When I did this slide, it was 23%. Then I saw another statistic that said 27%. So I'm assuming after this census, we'll probably be around 30% of people who are atheist, agnostic, or don't practice religion. Um, and so, what's interesting about that is they are not a group that's very well represented in elected office. People tend to say that they do not trust people who do not have a religious belief. They do not believe that they can be moral people. But as this group continues to grow, it could change politics and the type of people who can run for office, and the emphasis that we put on religion may become less and less. Economic class is a given. The issues of the poor, the middle class, and the wealthy are very different, and people tend to act in their own self interest. We have another chapter where we'll talk about that in more detail. And then the political environment, which is what we're seeing right now. But when Americans are experiencing a drastic disruption to their way of life. You could say when Americans are nervous and scared, it can drastically change the way they vote in unexpected ways. The Civil War, the Great Depression, 9/11, and then now the pandemic. People may vote in ways that they may not have voted before because they are scared of the environment they are living in, and they're going to vote for who they believe can, pull the country out of it. And it may not be the person they normally would have voted for just on party affiliation or ideology. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in November, how people vote. You know, we'll talk about polls in a minute, but we're seeing some very low poll numbers for Donald Trump, some very low public opinion ratings, which means that he's losing some of his base support. And some of that could be attributable to the situation we're in right now, not just with COVID 19, but the effects of COVID 19, like people being unemployed, people having to shut down their businesses like bars and things because the pandemic is going on longer here than it has in other countries. And so that could have an influence on people voting in different ways than they may have in the past. All right, political knowledge. Being knowledgeable of politics and government is a good indicator of whether someone is open to new information. So again, kind of along with being educated, people who are educated tend to scrutinize information a little more than those who are not. And so, you know, now that you're a college educated individual and you're sitting through my class and we're talking about polls and things like that, you're going to scrutinize that information more. We already know that all the stuff we see on social media can't, just be taken at face value. The stuff you see in the media has a bias and you understand that. And so, people who are knowledgeable tend to be more open to new information or really want to get the facts of a particular issue rather than just going along, with whichever side they tend to agree with. So hopefully you'll scrutinize information, and we have some other chapters on the media and social media and how we consume information where we'll talk about this more. Political knowledge is often dictated by the importance given to an issue to a particular community. This is kind of like what I talked about with immigration. If you ask Latinos, especially those from Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, these countries are dealing with the issue of immigration, with detention centers. Even if they're not at a personal level, they may have family who are trying to come here, family who are being detained and things like that. So that particular issue has a higher level of importance in the Latino community than maybe to the white community or to the African American community or the Asian community in this election. If we're talking about the African American community, we have, Black Lives Matter, social justice, that, police brutality, holding people accountable. And that issue is going to be at the top of the list for important things they want to see candidates address. So this can vary from community to community based on what the environment is for that community at a given time. The problem with being knowledgeable about politics and government is that it takes an investment of time. And most of you are not political nerds like I am. I keep up with this stuff religiously because it's my job. But for most people, the very least is just keeping up with the candidates who are running for office and what they stand for, what they believe in, what their platform is. Hopefully, when you go vote, you at least know who you're voting for and what those candidates believe. But just keeping up with government and politics can be overwhelming, especially in a society where we're just bombarded with information all day. And that's why people tend to vote just based on party lines, because they see the D or the R next to a candidate's name and just assume that that person believes close enough to what they do that they'll support that person. And then we talked about where we consume information. We'll talk about that more in our media chapter. Now, how we exchange information has changed pretty drastically. Um, the marketplace of ideas is the idea that we have a public forum where people exchange beliefs and ideas. In the United States, we have the freedom of speech. Everyone can contribute, put ideas out there, um, and have their voice heard in some capacity. Um, the hope is with something like the marketplace of ideas is that ideas have to compete for recognition, and we hope that the good ideas rise to the top and that bad ideas are rejected. So, what's a bad idea? I'd say white supremacy. White supremacy is a bad idea. Supremacy of any one group is a bad idea in a multi ethnic society like ours. Nazism is a bad idea. Sexual harassment is a bad idea. And for the most part, our society has rejected these ideas. Um, but we are seeing some people who still hold on to ideas like white supremacy and Nazism and all that kind of stuff. And in our system, they have the right to express those ideas. Um, One of the things that we have become very bad about in our society is shutting people down and not letting them talk. Now, I don't want to hear Nazis talk. I don't want to hear white supremacists talk just as much as I'm sure you don't want to. The problem is that when we shut people down and deny them their free speech, it actually helps them make their case that they have something to say, and obviously there must be some truth to it because people aren't letting them talk. By shutting down speech, we can actually inadvertently cause people to be drawn to the idea because, conspiracies are popular in this country. And so if we shut somebody down and we don't let them talk, then there is a contingent of people out there who will think that that person has something important to say, and it's obvious because society's not letting them speak. So my argument has always been to use the marketplace of ideas against bad ideas. So if somebody's espousing these ideas, the best course of action is not to shut them down and not let them talk. It's to come prepared with better ideas. Make their idea look stupid and use information to do it. So, on college campuses, we're terrible about this. People come to talk at a college campus. Students don't agree with them, so they shout them down and things like that. They have every right to speak just as much as the people you agree with. But if they are open to engaging in debate, then make them look like a fucking idiot because you have better ideas than they do. That's how you fight terrible ideas. Um, Political leaders. Political leaders can be a valuable tool in promoting ideas. Charismatic and strong leaders can influence people just because of their presence. Some of the people we look at, in this regard: Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, George W. Bush, Barack Obama. All of these politicians had a charisma, a way with words, a personality, that kind of made people feel comfortable, kind of pulled people into what they were saying. If you look at someone like JFK, JFK came about when TV was blowing up in our country, and so you had this well put together, good looking guy on TV talking about unpopular ideas like civil rights and integration and things like that. But people listened because he was so charismatic. Um, if you ever listen to George W. Bush talk, George W. Bush kind of had this folksy country boy charm that, you may not have agreed with what he was saying, but he could make people feel comfortable like they were just having a conversation with one of their friends. And then with Barack Obama, it was a little different kind of charisma. It was this charisma where he seemed like the smartest guy in the room. And he kind of had this calm, cool demeanor where he kept things, very laid back, and people trusted him. Compare that to Donald Trump. Donald Trump tries to bully people, tries to uh, can't really open his mouth without telling a lie, and so it turns people off. And it may have taken some time for people to catch on to it, but it is starting to show in his approval ratings and things like that. So having a charismatic leader will go a long way in pulling people into a message. Interest groups and media we won't talk about right now because I have chapters on both of those issues. Now, how do we measure public opinion, or how do politicians know what public opinion is? The most accurate way we have of measuring it is using polls, and polls are not accurate 100% of the time. Um, this can be for a lot of reasons, and we'll talk about that. But polls are still the most scientific way we have of gauging what the population feels. Now, one of the most important decisions behind a poll is the sample, deciding who we're going to ask questions to. And a bad choice in this area can skew the outcome of the entire poll. So we want to avoid that. So let's say I want to conduct a poll about how citizens in the state of Texas are going to vote in the 2020 presidential election. And let's say I just ask all of the students in my classes that question. Is that a sufficient sample to answer the question? The answer is no, because there's a lot of reasons. Now, sorry, uh, my students are probably a very diverse population, racially and ethnically, but you're not a very diverse population in age, uh, in location. You're all at the same university. Many of you probably are from DFW. You're not a very diverse population in your experience, and most of you don't have kids and things like that. So it's not going to give me the best picture of the entire state of Texas. Instead, I'm going to want to go around the entire state and ask as many people at random these questions to get a good idea of how the state feels. Now, we call that a simple random sample, just asking random people in that represent the group we're trying to get the opinion of, ask as many people as possible. Um, you know, if we don't do this at random, the poll can be biased. And this used to be much easier back before cell phones, when everybody had a landline. Um, Pollsters would just pull out the phone book or get a list of phone numbers and just start calling people at random and ask them questions. And, this was effective because 95% of American homes, probably, towards like the 1980s and 90s, had a phone in the home. And so now their willingness to participate is something that, you couldn't predict, but people with landlines, you could at least try and contact people at random. If you tried to do that today, it wouldn't be a good sample because the majority of the American public uses cell phones. Most of the people that still have landlines are usually older individuals, baby boomers. So we wouldn't get an accurate poll for the entire country. And only about 15% of people will participate today, which means that turnout is low when we're polling people, and so it's hard to get an accurate picture. A sampling error is when we ask too few people, or we make some kind of error in who we choose to ask these questions to. Now, the way you design the questions is very important as well. We don't want to lead people into giving us the answer that we want. Some people would say, well, instead of doing phone surveys, why don't you do internet surveys? Well, internet surveys are often not accurate. The reason being is that, one, let's say I want to measure how people are going to vote in the 2020 presidential election, and I post that on Facebook. Well, Facebook doesn't just exist in the United States, it exists worldwide. And so people would have access to my survey who don't live in the United States. So that wouldn't give me, an accurate picture of what people in our country feel. Same if I put it on Twitter. Now, let's say I put it on Fox News or I put it on MSNBC's websites. Then I'm going to get biased responses because we know that those outlets cater to very specific political ideologies. So there's very few places short of, you know, emailing it directly to people where you could get the kind of response and outcome that you want. The most accurate are face-to-face surveys. The problem being is that it's very expensive. So if I wanted to just poll people in the entire state of Texas, I would have to travel around the entire state. And so that can be very limiting as far as time. Most people don't have that kind of time to do that. We want polls out very quickly, and it's very expensive. It's almost cost prohibitive. Social desirability effect. This is what we think happened in 2016. So if you remember in 2016, all the polls told us that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. And on election night, Donald Trump wins and he starts bragging about how all the polls were wrong, they're fake news, yada, yada, yada. Well, what happens, the polls that predict the elections for us, they're called exit polls. And pollsters will wait at polling locations all across the country and ask people who they voted for when they're leaving the voting booth. Well, if you remember with Donald Trump's campaign, he was a very divisive candidate. He said some very racist things. He said some very unpopular things. He was just viewed in an unfavorable light. And when people are asked these questions, they don't want to be disliked or perceived as, they don't want to be perceived as a certain type of person. So they may lie and say that they voted for someone they didn't because that candidate is more socially desirable. And so we think this is what skewed 2016 was people voting for Trump but not wanting it to be known that they voted for Trump. So that can skew polling as well, and there's really nothing you can do about that. Selection bias, polling error when a survey focuses too much on one group or a person with a type of belief. So let's say I want to do a poll about citizen attitudes on abortion, and I just ask people at churches. Well, obviously, I'm probably going to get an outcome of that poll against abortion because Christian morality is very heavily against abortion. So, just in who I selected to ask these questions to, I've already skewed the survey. Push poll is where the questions can be worded in such a way that it can kind of manipulate people into giving you the answer you want. So, again, let's say I want to do a survey about citizen attitudes towards abortion. And I ask the question, how do you feel about abortion? Should it be legal or illegal in our country? That's a perfectly reasonable question. But if I stop someone and I say, do you support the murdering of children? That is a very heavy manipulative question because nobody wants to answer yes to that question. So I'm pushing them to give me the answer I want so the survey will say what I want it to say. And you have to be very careful about this. Um, Bandwagon effect. This can happen in polls that are done after voting has started. So let's say voting starts in November, or especially during the primary, where the states don't all vote at the same time, not the general election, but the primary. Um, as people start to vote in the early states and it looks like a certain candidate is becoming the front runner, people may change their vote because people like to be on winning teams. And so, if we say coming out of the primary, it looks like Joe Biden is building support and is going to be the front runner, then people in the later states may go ahead and vote for Joe Biden because they want to be on that winning team and be able to celebrate with everybody and all that kind of stuff. It's just like people who say they supported a certain football team and then when they win the Super Bowl, but you didn't hear that person say anything about that team before the Super Bowl, same kind of effect. And then this picture is just a picture of one of the biggest failures of polling before the 2016 election, back when Harry S. Truman ran for president. All the polls said his opponent, Dewey, was going to win the presidency. And they were so confident in those polls that many of the newspapers printed their papers for the next day early because all the polls said Dewey was going to win. And Harry S. Truman wins the presidency, and this is Truman holding up a newspaper laughing at the fact that they got it wrong.